On the outskirts of the small town stood an old church that the locals had long avoided. Its belfry towered above the trees, but no one heard the bell anymore. They said it had been broken for a long time. However, there was a legend. If the 13th bell rang at midnight, whoever heard it would never return home. Alice, a young student, has always loved mysticism and ancient legends. When she heard about this story, she decided to visit the church to see if the scary tale was true. "It's all nonsense," she told her friend Kirill, who nevertheless persuaded her to take him with her. "And if it isn't?" he asked, and you could hear the anxiety in his voice. "Then we'll record a video for my blog and become stars." Alice grinned, pulling out her camera. In the evening they arrived at the church. The abandoned building looked gloomy. Its walls were cracked and its doors hung on rusty hinges. "Why is it so quiet here?" Kirill whispered, looking around. "It's just the atmosphere," Alice answered, pointing the camera at the bell tower. "It's perfect for our video." They stepped inside. The air was heavy, smelling damp and rotten. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and dusty cobwebs hung from the ceiling. "Look," Alice said, pointing to the bell rope that dangled right in front of them. "No one has been able to use that bell for decades," Kirill muttered. But at that moment she noticed that the rope looked strangely clean, as if it had been touched recently. They climbed up to the bell tower. The view from the top was frightening. Dark woods surrounded the church on all sides, and moonlight broke through the clouds. "Why is this bell here at all?" Kirill asked, examining the mechanism. "I don't know, but it looks unnatural," replied Alice. The bell was huge, made of black metal that seemed to absorb light. On its surface were engraved strange symbols that Alice had never seen before. "Let's go down," Kirill suddenly suggested. "I don't like this place." "Wait, we haven't heard what it sounds like yet," said Alice, pulling the rope. The bell made a low, long sound that echoed around the neighborhood. The sound was so loud that Alice and Kirill's ears popped. "Are you crazy?" Kirill shouted, covering his ears with his hands. But Alice didn't have time to answer. A strange cracking sound came from the forest, as if someone was slowly breaking branches. "What is it?" she whispered, pointing the camera at the forest. The silence was interrupted by a second ringing sound. This time it was louder, and the air around her grew cold. "We have to leave," Kirill said firmly, grabbing Alice's hand. But she froze. Her gaze was fixed on the forest, where something large and dark flashed among the trees. "Who is there?" Alice shouted, but Kirill pulled her back. "It's just your fantasy. Let's get out of here." As they began to descend the bell tower, a third chime sounded. This sound was almost inhuman, a strange, otherworldly whisper. Alice stopped for a moment and glanced at her watch. It was exactly 0:03. "This is impossible," she whispered. Her phone showed that only 3 minutes had passed since the beginning of their experiment, but it felt as if time had frozen. And then they heard someone start to move downstairs. In the church itself, the footsteps were slow but distinct, as if someone was waiting for them. "There's someone here," Kirill said. But the doors were closed. Alice whispered. The footsteps grew louder, and suddenly there was a fourth chime. The fourth ringing sounded loud and long, as if the bell was echoing from the depths of the night. Alice and Kirill froze on the narrow staircase leading downward. The footsteps below continued unabated, their sound echoing off the walls of the church. "We have to hide," Kirill whispered, looking around. "Hide?" Alice shook her head. "There's no one here. It's just the wind or, something with the tree." But even her voice sounded uncertain. Footsteps were getting closer. Someone was coming up the stairs. "They're coming this way," Kirill shouted, grabbing Alice's arm. She lashed out, trying not to panic, and pointed the camera downward, and the flashlight's beam. The stairs seemed empty, but the sound of footsteps grew louder, as if they were already on the next step. "There's no one there," she whispered, her voice trembling. A fifth ringing sound split the air. The sound was sharp, penetrating straight into consciousness. Alice felt her head fill with a strange whisper. "Do you hear that?" she asked, looking at Kirill. But he was silent. His gaze was forward, his eyes wide with terror. "Kirill?" Alice shook him by the shoulder. He turned his head slowly, and there was something strange on his face, a weak, unnatural smile. "They're waiting for us," he said quietly. "Who's they?" Alice took a step back, feeling the cold envelope her body. Kirill remained silent, but his hand rose, pointing down toward the stairs. For a moment, Alice saw it, a dark figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It was barely discernible in the faint light of the flashlight, but its outline seemed too large for a human. It's impossible, she exhaled, trying to look away, but she couldn't. The figure slowly raised its head, and Alice felt her heart clench. Where the eyes should be, there were empty black hollows from which thick smoke strained. A sixth ringing sound made her recoil as the sound pierced the air beside her. The figure moved up the stairs. "Run!" Alice shouted, grabbing Kirill's arm. But he stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the shadow. "She's calling us," he whispered. Alice, with all her might, pulled Kirill with her. They ran downstairs, past the empty staircase, toward the church entrance. But when they reached the doors, it turned out they were locked. The wooden sashes were cold to the touch, and the metal hinges were covered in frost. "This can't be true," Alice shouted, tugging on the handle. The seventh bell rang above their heads, and the light in the church began to fade. Now there was only darkness around them. Kirill slowly turned to Alice. His face was contorted, and his smile grew even wider. "We're already inside," he said. "We've always been inside." A dark figure appeared in the center of the church. Her arms stretched forward and her head tilted slightly to the side. There was a whisper in the silence. "6 more, and it's over." "No," Alice shouted, grabbing the camera and pointing it at the figure. "I'm not going to let this happen." She pointed the flashlight at the shadow, but the light only drowned in the thick blackness, as if swallowed up. "Alice," Kirill's voice sounded nearby, but it no longer seemed his own. "Don't resist." The 8th chime rang out, and Alice felt time stand still around her. The air in the church grew heavier with each passing second. She looked at the camera, her hands shaking. Interference appeared on the screen, but among them she saw herself. In the reflection on the screen, Alice was no longer herself. Her eyes were empty and her face stretched slowly and unnaturally into a smile. The 9th chime split her consciousness. The 9th chime seemed to cut the silence into pieces. Alice felt her knees go up and her heart pounding frantically. Kirill stood beside her, but his gaze was blank, and the smile on his face stretched wider and wider, becoming frighteningly unnatural. "Kirill, can you hear me?" she shouted, shaking him by the shoulders. "We're already here," he whispered, his voice sounding like an echo overlapping itself. "Don't fight it." At that moment, she noticed that the shadow in the center of the church was moving. Its outline became clearer and clearer, and out of the black abyss, arms began to reach out long, thin, as if woven from smoke. The 10th chime rang out loud and long, making the walls of the church tremble. Dust began to fall from the ceiling, and the air was filled with a strange odor of burning and dampness. Alice stepped back, pointing the flashlight at the figure, but the light seemed to drown in her shadow, leaving not even a glimmer. "What do you want?" she shouted, trying to suppress the tremor in her voice. The answer was a whisper, coming from all directions. "You came. Then you are ready to hear the 13th chime." Alice felt her breathing quicken. "I'm not going to stay here," she shouted, grabbing the camera. But the camera screen she turned on showed not the church, but something else entirely. On the camera screen, Alice saw other faces. They were men and women, their expressions frozen in a horrifying grimace of fear and pain. They were whispering words that were hard for her to make out. But one word was repeated over and over again: "Run." She looked up, and her heart sank. Those faces were beginning to show through on the walls of the church. They stared at her from the cracks in the bricks, their eyes glistening and their lips moving as if they were still trying to warn her. The 11th chime was louder than the previous ones. The floor beneath Alice's feet began to shake. Kirill started to move forward, his steps slow and unnatural. Alice grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "Where are you going?" she shouted. He turned his head, his eyes completely black. "We have to finish this," he said. "It's the only way we can leave." "What are you talking about?" Alice screamed. But he broke free of her grip and walked straight toward the shadow that now occupied almost the entire center of the church. As the 12th chime sounded, the shadow began to take shape. It was the silhouette of a tall man with long limbs. His features were blurred, but the smile on his face became distinct and sinister. "It's impossible," Alice whispered, feeling her body begin to tremble. The figure reached forward and Kirill froze, his body beginning to be covered in smoke as if he was being sucked inside this entity. Alice screamed, rushing towards him, but an invisible force threw her back against the wall. The 13th chime for you, came the voice of a shadow. Alyssa rose to her feet, feeling the symbol on her neck that she had happened to notice in the cell mirror begin to burn her skin. It was the sign she had seen on the bell. "If I destroy the bell," she whispered. She glanced at the stairs leading upstairs. It was her only chance. She ran up the stairs, hearing the whispers grow louder. The figure remained at the bottom, but the shadows reached for her, clinging to her legs. "You won't make it," a voice whispered. Alice climbed up the bell tower, turned around and looked at the bell mechanism. Nearby hung an old hammer that had been used to repair it. As the last whisper rang out, a 13th chime filled the air. "This is the end," she said, swinging the hammer. Alice stood on the bell tower, her heart racing. Below, the shadows grew thicker and thicker, and the figure in the center of the church slowly raised its head. Watching her, the whispering didn't stop, turning into a low rumble that filled the entire space. Her hand clutched a heavy hammer. She looked at the bell, massive, made of black metal, with engraved symbols that seemed alive. "You wouldn't dare," came a voice from the void. It was the voice of a shadow. It sounded from everywhere, echoing in her head. "Destroy him, and you will destroy yourself," the voice continued, both frightening and tantalizing at the same time. The first hammering sounded. The sound rolled through the neighborhood, mingling with the 13th ringing that seemed to last an eternity. Alice felt her hands begin to go numb, and the world around her began to distort. "No!" Kirill shouted from downstairs. His voice was hoarse and distorted, as if he was speaking out of his own mouth. "Stop! You don't understand. I won't let you take us," Alice shouted, swinging again. The symbols on the bell began to glow a bright purple light, as if reacting to her strikes. Down below, the shadows began to stretch upward, trying to reach Alice. They moved as if alive, and their whispers grew louder. "You can't destroy what has always been here," the voice whispered. "The bell is not just metal, it's a gateway." "Then I will destroy the gate," Alice shouted, putting all her strength into another blow. The bell trembled, and a crack appeared on its surface. Kirill, standing below, suddenly screamed. His body began to distort as if he was being pulled into the shadows. "Alice, they won't let me go," he screamed, his voice full of pain. Alice froze for a moment, her arms weakening. "Save me, you have to save me." But then she saw his face. It no longer belonged to Cyril. His eyes were completely black, and his smile was wide and unnatural. "It wasn't him," she whispered, realizing that her friend had long been a prisoner of darkness. She gathered her strength and struck the final blow. The bell cracked and there was a deafening explosion of sound. The vibration traveled through the entire building, making the walls shake. The symbols on the bell began to go out, and the lights in the church flickered. The shadows began to retreat, letting out eerie screams. "You did it," whispered a voice that now sounded fainter, "but the price will be high." The bell tower began to collapse. Alice felt the floor beneath her feet shake, and then began to go downward. She managed to grab onto the rope, which miraculously remained intact. When she came down, everything around her was plunged into silence. The shadows were gone, and Kirill lay motionless on the floor. She ran over to him, shaking hands trying to check for a pulse. "Cyril, are you there?" He slowly opened his eyes, his gaze blank. "They're gone," he whispered before losing consciousness. Alice and Kirill walked out of the church, which was now ruined. The bell no longer existed, and the air around them seemed lighter. But in the distance, at the edge of the forest, she noticed something strange. On the ground lay a shard of the bell, black and shiny. As she came closer, her own face was reflected on its surface. She stopped, feeling a chill run down her back. Her reflection was smiling.